Hi, welcome everyone. Welcome. So good to have you with us here at Drisha. Today's class is the first session of Olam, Shanah, Nefesh, Becoming Attuned to Revelation in Text, Self, and World with Rabbi Dr. Ariel Mayse. The sources will be shared here on the screen and also will be posted on the chat. Just a few words about the class. Prepare for Shavuot by exploring mystical teachings on the concept of revelation. Rather than a single historical moment, we'll see that Kabbalistic and Hasidic authors describe the divine voice as a vital force unfolding from creation and across the generations. With an eye to ethics and practice, we'll pay special attention to how we can attune ourselves to hear the sacred voice in the text that we study. In the contemplative realm deep within our soul, and in the magnificent fullness of the world around us. And just for those of you who are meeting Dr. Mayse for the first time, he joined the faculty of Stanford University in 2017 as an assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies. He's the rabbi in residence at Attuned, Jewish Maker Institute, a lead fellow at the Institute of Jewish Spirituality and Society, and a senior fellow at the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies at UC Berkeley. Previously, he served as the director of Jewish Studies and visiting assistant professor of modern Jewish thought at Hebrew College in Newton, Massachusetts, and a research fellow at the Frankel Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies of the University of Michigan. Mayse also holds a PhD in Jewish Studies from Harvard University and rabbinic ordination from Bet Midrash Ariel in Israel. And with that, I'll turn it to you, Rabbi Mayse.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be here together to think about this issue, which is hopefully of spiritual and intellectual concern to us as we get closer and closer to the holiday of Shavuot. It's wonderful that this is happening right around the time of Lag BaOmer, obviously one of the other great holidays of Revelation in a slightly different form. So nice to see everyone here. Some new friends and some old friends. Wonderful. Lovely to be here together. So Evie has just thoughtfully dropped into the chat the source sheet. I'm going to put it in as a Google Doc in case anyone would like to see it that way. Google has just really revolutionized one of their already wonderful services. You can now add tabs to Google Docs, which I have been really enjoying. So actually all of our sources are going to be on that document. We're going to have one for today, one for next week, and one for the week after that, and you can easily toggle between them. Most of you know me, but not all. Evie gave me a very kind introduction. I teach religious studies at Stanford. I've been a friend and admirer of Drisha for at least 15 years now myself, and my wife, Adina, has been involved in Drisha for even longer. She was one of the, not one of the first, but amongst the first of the Drisha Summer High School program, these many years ago. A lot of my work these days has to do with questions in the way that religion and Jewish thought and Jewish mystical sources in particular can touch the realm of climate change and climate thinking. So that's not going to be an explicit concern of our course, but when we talk about revelation through the world and through the more than human world, that will come up. But our topic for today and for the next 3 classes is the question of revelation and its meaning in our day. So the meaning of revelation in our day. I think we are often taught, or we're often acculturated to think about revelation as a moment in Shemot, the giving of the Torah, around chapters 19, 18, 20, perhaps going up through chapters 24, some questions around when that ends, but it's you might say, an excursus within or the center of the book of Exodus. That then is reiterated literally, if not also literally, in the book of Devarim as Moses restates or reinstates the Ten Commandments. The opacity of what we know of Revelation is debated amongst the sages and the medievals, and also amongst the moderns. Who was there is a question of great debate. Was it mostly just Moses, or just Moses? Was it also the people? Was it, as some Kabbalistic sources suggest, also the animals that received the Torah at Mount Sinai? And of course, this has a lot to do with questions of authority. If it's the people, then the Torah is the communal property. If it is Moses as the perfectly trained prophet, as it is for Maimonides, then it is that becomes the vision of the sage par excellence. What was revealed is also a great question. Was it the 10 Commandments? Was it all 613 commandments somehow woven in together? Was it all of the written Torah? Or was it, as some suggest, all of Torah given in perhaps inchoate or embryonic form at that moment? When it happens? Was it at Sinai? Well, yes, of course, but did it happen out of order, as the biblical sources seem to suggest? If you've ever read chapters 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 24, all the way up to the Golden Calf, it's actually really hard to get a handle on the timeline of what's going on there. Or did the revelation happen over time, as one rabbinic source seems to suggest? So for what was a really momentous occurrence, a religion configuring event, we actually know very little. But in Kabbalah and in Hasidut, another vision is advanced. Revelation is described as an ongoing process, one that began not with Sinai, but with creation, with God gazing into the Torah and creating the world. The Kabbalists pick up that ancient midrash in Bereshit Rabbah. It's right there in the first midrash on the first chapters of the book of Genesis. But they use it not to describe God gazing into the divine wisdom, but God looking into a version of Torah, which is a kind of infinite sweep of possibility. God, as it were, looks into the oceanic possibility, this oceanic reservoir of what might be. That's the Torah before it is given. And in doing so, creates the world and creates a world in which divine wisdom and divine presence are invested within each and everything. So creation is itself a moment in which the infinite divine becomes garbed in physicality. That which was one becomes multiplicity. At Sinai, say the Kabbalists, God is clothed not only in the world, but in the Word. God takes the mantle of language, breaking the chains of silence, and becoming engarbed in stories, commandments, and letters. But they also claim, and here I think it's a very striking point, that revelation never ends. The verse in Devarim, Kol Gadol V'lo Yasaf, is read not as "that was a great and mighty voice to which we shall not add," but as "it is a great and mighty voice without end." Saf Yasaf, not from Lehosif, but Saf from Sof, or ending, like Ein Sof. It is a limitless voice. And therefore revelation continues to unfold. And in these sources, there's commonly a distinction made between Matan Torah, a kind of one-time moment, and Kabbalat Torah. If Matan Torah is the giving of the Torah, Kabbalat Torah is the work of each and every generation to receive and welcome the Torah. The same with Kabbalat Shabbat, having both of those meanings, to receive and to welcome. So too, we receive and welcome the Torah anew in each and every generation and in each and every year. And I decided to title this class Olam, Shanah, Nefesh for two reasons. One, there's a verse in the descriptions of Revelation that describe the mountain itself as being fully covered up in smoke and in fire, ashan meaning fire and clouds. And in the hands of the Kabbalists, going back to a cryptic and elliptical book called Sefer Yetzirah from sometime in the 2nd through 9th centuries, no one has any idea when it is written, Ashan becomes an acronym for Olam, Shanah, Nefesh, for time and for space and for human soulfulness. And I think it's a helpful mnemonic for thinking about the different, let's say, planes or different domains of revelation. Shanah, time, is the yearly giving and receiving of the text of the Torah. Revelation continues as we meet God in the text. Olam, world, we meet God in God's words in the world itself. And Nefesh, if we can quiet something of that buzzing and pinging that surrounds us so ubiquitously and find that still small voice within, that too is a part of the project of revelation. So those are a few remarks just to frame where I hope we're going to go and what I'm hoping to do. Any questions about what I've said? Thoughts, responses? Yeah, Beth, nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. I'm curious about the idea that the animals also receive Torah at Har Sinai. Can you expand on that a little? Who says that? I think it's charming and wonderful idea.
I'll say a lot more about that in one of the later classes, but it's a medieval text from Sefer Kanah, which is a text that we don't really have a good handle on who wrote, but think 14th, 15th century in Ashkenaz, and it's just sort of dropped in on these descriptions of Revelation, where given that the Israelites are wandering around in the Midbar with all these animals, we know, both because they're sacrificing some of them and also because our animal companion species go where we go, and we took many of them out of Egypt. The author of this text says, well, if everyone is there, everyone is not just all people, but the animals are there. So if you then connect that to Rabbi Yochanan's statement in Eruvin about had the Torah not been given, we would have learned the Torah from the animals. A really interesting way of thinking about animals as agents of revelation comes to the fore. So we'll think about that actually in our third session, when we think about how we hear God's voice in the world around us. It's not just the mountains, it's not just the trees, but it's also our sympatric co-species, whether it's the roosters or the tigers or the bears, that also becomes revealers of Torah. Other thoughts, questions, responses? Okay. So if you have either the PDF or the Google Doc, that will be very handy to you since we're going to be diving into some texts now. In thinking about this question of revelation as in text, I'd like to think especially about what it means to study with an eye to revelation. When we think about study, we often think about, oh, I got to get to the bottom of the text. I've got to understand it. I need to understand what the words mean in this particular context. Those of us who exist in academia think about history. We think about concepts. We think about the history of concepts. We think about a lot of things. What would it mean if when we open Torah, we're not only opening the book, but we're opening our heart to the way that it might work upon us in a kind of vulnerable moment. It's a reading that is not about how can we be either cleverly brushing the text against the grain, or how can we take something from it, a kind of extractive reading, but how can we attune ourselves to be listeners to the text? That's where I want to go first off. Then we're going to think about revelation and language, and then we're going to think actually quite programmatically about what does it mean to approach Jewish text study as revelation. Are there certain texts that make that easier? Are there certain texts that make that harder? And we're going to go from there. So we begin with a text from Rabbi Ze'ev Wolf of Zhitomir, one of the Hasidic followers of Rabbi Dov Ber of Mezrich, who himself was a kind of disciple of Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, the founder, sort of Hasidism. So think this is a text sometime from the 1780s or the 1790s, right about in there. And he points out something that he's not the only one to have said. In fact, many people have pointed this out, that when we say Birkot Torah, anu mevarchin Birkot Torah leshon hoveh, v'lo natan leshon avar. When we go to the Torah, or we say the blessings on Torah, we say not God gave us the Torah, but notain ha-Torah. God is the giver of Torah. So that could be that God is the giver of Torah, and God is still the giver of Torah. God's still here. The Torah has been given. That's one grammatical way of understanding it. But homiletically, in the hands of the Kabbalists, and in the hands of actually some number of the medievals, as well as certainly the Hasidic thinkers, notain ha-Torah becomes a way of thinking about Torah as a ever-flowing font of revelation. It is notain Torah because it's constantly being given in the presence. Shenoten ad od et Torah. So the fact that it is being in the that the bracha, the blessing has been formulated in the present tense, teaches us shenoten od et Torah. The Torah is still being given. Okay. Is that true? What does that even mean? Are we like adding on? Is there a nispach? Is there an appendix to the Torah, right? We end the book of Deuteronomy, and now we're going to have Deuteronomy part 2, part 3. If I woke you up in the middle of the night and I asked, noten od et Torah, God is still giving the Torah, what would you say? This is not a knowledge question, this is a thinking question.
Well, I mean, from
Hey, of course,
experience,
let me go back to sleep.
Yeah, exactly. That's always it. Okay, Brian, yeah?
yes, it certainly seems to me a wonderful and very generous invitation to interpretation and application in new and different contexts.
Yeah. But is it more than just saying the Torah has been given and it's been handed over to people to levaer, to give explanation, or lefaresh, to interpret, or even letargem, to translate and interpret? What else do we get if we say that it is constantly being given? That's a question to you, Brian. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah. um, I think for me, it's a sense that all of creation, including myself, is unfinished. And this perpetual re-engagement with Torah adds another brick to my being and the being of the world.
Great. Another brick, another letter in the unfolding of that process. So one way of understanding text study is I, Brian, am a finished entity. This text is a finished entity, and we're going to meet one another, and something generative will come from that. Another way of thinking about that is that I, Brian, am an unfinished entity. That Torah itself is consistently unfolding, and in the meeting of my unique being and that text, something new is going to flow forth. Now think about it, about what happens if you have a chavruta, someone to have a conversation with. Then the revelation happens in the middle of that triangle as the voice of God emerges from our conversation. Beth.
Considering that we have generations upon generations upon generations. If I understand correctly, you, Ariel, have children. Well, I'm older than they are by quite a bit. And so I started receiving Torah decades before your kids were ever born, and before you were born too, for that matter. And so there almost has to be an ongoing revelation to take into account all the successive generations of humans who come into the world.
I think you've hit the nail on the head from a slightly different direction, which is that if you say that Torah was a one-time event, then the 600,000 people who were there, they're the ones who really got it, and everyone else is kind of inclining toward an echo at best. And the farther away we get from that moment, the farther we have devolved, to use that kind of term, from that original moment. And what if we understand it in the opposite way, which is that one of the things that not only creates a point of conversation between generations, as texts do, but a thread of continuity, an almost like undercurrent of divine vitality that connects and reconnects each and every generation, we all then become participants. We're, setting sail on that same ocean, even though we set sail at different times. And those who come before have a different understanding and perhaps in many respects a much greater vision of that wisdom than those of us who are beginning to set sail. Although one of the nice things about having children is that the Piasetzner Rebbe says that as we get older, we have a tendency, and this is not always true. I know many people for whom this is not true. But as we get older, we have a tendency, and this is socially constructed in us, to align our thoughts with the world around us. We have a kind of litmus test. Any kind of thinking, does it conform with the world around us? And if it doesn't, I'm not interested in, right? Like one of my kids once got into almost a fist fight with someone because the person said, you can't be a bird when you grow up. You can't be a cardinal. And my son was mad. He was really mad. And so he said, why can't I do it? Why can't I be a bird when I grow up? The dinosaurs did it. I'm like, why can't I do it too? And so the Piasetzner Rebbe points out is that as we get older, we have this, what he calls a mevaker pnimi, literally an inner critic for thinking about that. And he says that one of the great gifts of children is that they can imagine a world otherwise than as it is, which is why we have such enormous gifts from their creativity. And I think the same is true with revelation, because as we'll see, we are not passive participants in that. We're not becoming funnels. We're not just there as passive recipients, but we are active articulators of what that Torah becomes in the world, which means that at different ages and at different stages of life, it's also going to change. And in fact, that's one of the things that this text is going to say, and certainly across, let's not call them generational divides, let's call them generational links. Gurval, yeah.
I think it reminds me of one of the texts that you source in your book about the well. There's a beautiful passage. I think it's one of the Zoharic texts that you quote, and Torah is this woman, is this maiden. It is alive. It is alive, and forgive me for gendering, but she decides. She has a will. The text has a will. The text is alive. The text shows a little something to the reader, and then she retracts, and then she comes back in, and then she retracts, and I find that absolutely lovely, that it's not just us, the readers, that decide what to make out of the text in the context that we're in, but it is also the text that has some, and I'm, obviously apologize for the kind of, magical bullshit a little bit in my language, but it is this idea that the text also has will and decides to reveal things to us readers and hide and reveal and hide and reveal. And anyway, I don't know if you remember the source that you quote, but it's a beautiful, like the maiden, one of the maiden metaphors.
Maiden
Plays with the reader. She plays with the reader constantly. She has fun. She just attracts him and charms him, and then anyway.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's the famous parable or the passage about the maiden locked away in the tower, as a description of Torah, but really as a description of wisdom within the text. That's the maiden within the tower, which, you want a better proof text for the Zohar being a 13th century Spanish creation. That is a passage where you can literally hear the flamenco music in the background. It is Spanish, Iberian romanticism par excellence. Everything with the gender. I mean, like it's Don Quixote just a few hundred years before. But what I think, moving that aside from the from the from the medieval gendered paradigm, I think what the Zohar is trying to advance is a vision of the text which is an active participant in that in that process. And one of the reasons that it's active is that it's divine. It's a God text. And the reason that it's active is that the divine voice is there, and the divine voice is beckoning, because us and text and us, how do we describe that? That's the language of the Song of Songs. And so that's one of the reasons that in the Zohar, you can't read a page of the Zohar without reading a verse from the Song of Songs, because every time they talk about study, also when they talk about encountering the natural world, it's going to be the Song of Songs. And that's God's voice yearning for us and us yearning for the divine. My father-in-law, Rabbi Dr. Nehemiah Polin, has a pithy way of putting this. He says, one of the commitments of Jewish text study is being willing to sit with a text until it winks at you. And you might not always know when that's going to happen. And it might take some time. And it might actually take decades. But if you sit with it long enough, that text will wink. Chaim, please.
I think one other aspect is this incredible gift of God that we are co-creators of the world, and that this is a partnership with God in terms of creating anew and on a constant basis.
So we have, Chaim, if I'm understanding you correctly, there's an invitation to partnership that's implicit or explicit in creation, whether that is setting right the things that are broken or simply continuing the work of creation, whether that's through human industriousness, although I wouldn't say industrialization, through human industriousness, and our creative capacities. And then when it comes to the text, we are the articulators of divine voice. God is silent, or perhaps better, God's voice and human voice are intertwined one with the other. And in the same way that God is intertwined with the physical world, we give voice and articulation to, and perhaps even give words to, that divine voice. And that is one of the great gifts of human being. And it's also one of the great, maybe we could call it a lodestar of human responsibility. This, just speaking personally, is why I get so bothered when people say it's just what the text says. That's what the Torah says. That's what it says. Or that's Torah values, which I'm not adverse to Torah values. I'm actually very much in favor of finding ethical value in our tradition. But to speak as if it is this passive thing that exists on a shelf, and to speak with the voice of authority but without taking responsibility, is for me an evacuation of our ethical responsibility as interpreters. Was there a question that came in the chat? I can't see. Hold on.
I can read it out loud if you like.
Love that.
Okay. So Paul said, in the Song of Songs, do the lovers ultimately find each other or not?
Yeah.
Hmm.
Phone a friend?
Hmm.
Anyone know?
well, they seem to be chasing each other, but it's not clear that they actually meet.
Right. So there's this one chapter, there's this one passage at the end of chapter 3 where they kind of find each other, and then the curtain drops and the screen fades black. I don't know anything about what happens other than there's this moment of encounter, and then what happens? Chapter 4, they're on the look again and they can't find each other. And then at the very end, what does the lover say to the beloved? She says, "Go forth, flee, brach lecha dodi, go out into the world and go out." And I think one of the great things about the Song of Songs is the almost like circumnavigational, the centripetal force of this yearning for, and the near misses, and the wish to find becomes one of the driving forces of the seeking quality of religious life. And so, Guruval, that passage that you noted about um, about seeking to find the heroine in the tower, so too with the desire to stand in the presence of God, whether that's through text or whether that's otherwise. It's something that is infrequently consummated and yet always yearned for. And that's one of the great gifts of the metaphor that comes to us from the Song of Songs, which of course is not just a metaphor for text study, but it's also a metaphor for revelation. The way that that text is read within the rabbinic canon is that all the way going back to the 2nd or 3rd centuries of the Common Era, it's read as a metaphor for thinking about God's relationship in with the people of Israel, and with Mount Sinai in particular. And one of the places that we see this perhaps most eloquently is in Shir HaShirim Rabbah, the Midrash on the Song of Songs, which is all about Torah study, And that's actually one of the places where we get the first description of Torah study as a moment in which the letters, as they are read aloud, are rejoicing and connecting and become incandescent, that's the word that's used there, as they were on Sinai, as they were when they were given at Sinai. Okay, good. So let's continue with this kind of existential or situational reading. And Rabbi Zev Wolf of Shitiomer goes on. Kol echad mi Yisrael, each and every one of us has this obligation, we will see, le'erech bechinato ve'achanato, according to the erech bechinato means something like the not only the quality of one's soul, but really one's framework, and how one sees the world and where you are in the spiritual quest. Vehachanato, that's a word that I would, if I was in person, I would underline, I would highlight, and I would think, because this is going to be a critical one for us, mipesach le'atzeret lekabbalat Torah. So we are going to see that we have an obligation, or we have a privilege of preparing ourselves. And that's the word I want to zero in on, hachanato, of preparing ourselves from the time of Passover to Atzeret, to Shavuot, to the receiving of the Torah. We have an imperative and a possibility of preparing ourselves to receive the Torah anew. How do we do that? I think we're often taught to think about this time as a time of mourning. We don't go to concerts, we don't do this, we don't do that. If you, I think, are attentive to the development of those sources, it's not per se that it's a time of mourning. As one of my teachers, Adin Steinsaltz, used to say, it is 7 weeks of ritzinut, seriousness. You can also translate that as attentiveness to what we're going to get. But one of the things that I think is so wonderful about this text is that it undoes that, or let's say it doesn't undo it, but it adds another dimension to that. I'll skip a bunch here in the Hebrew, and just a teeny tiny bit actually in the Hebrew, and he's going to focus in on what happens each and every day. So he says, "Gdula mizeh afilu limud Torato shel adam shelomed hayom eino dome liyom chavero ki yadua lemaskil." So even the study that we do on a particular day is incomparable to that which we are doing on a different day, as is known to the wise, as is known to the person who is attentive. Upshita she'eno dome lebachinat kabbalot haTorah bichlalut im Am Yisrael shel Shanah echad l'Shanah acheret. So it means Shanah achat. So what he's saying is that, at least if I understand him correctly, is that Noten HaTorah opens up a way of thinking about revelation, which is across the generations and across the years, this ongoing process. But, he says, let us anchor this in our daily experience. Afilu limud Torato shel adam shelomed hayom eino dome leyom chavero. If I learn Torah one day, it's not going to be the same as a different day. And the same is true, and perhaps all the more so, about the fact that when we receive the Torah in our generation, it's different than what happened in each and every other generation, and that my own experience thereof is going to be different indeed from that of my entire generation. Each and every person has their own vantage point, their own framework for understanding that voice, their own way of listening to it. So now let me ask you all a question. What does it mean that my Torah study of one day is not the same as the next? Why is that? Is he talking about a different text? Right? One day I'm learning Talmud, the next day I'm learning Mishnah, the next day I'm learning philosophy, the next day I'm learning poetry.
Every day is a new creation.
Right. It dovetails exactly with what you had said earlier, in that this creation is an ongoing process. The circumstances are different. The world is different. Might look the same, but things are different. Ryan.
A reminder not to stop at the plain sense of the text. The infinite variety in the layers underneath the text.
Right. So the plain sense, which might mean grammar, or it might mean a particular kind of contextual understanding. You could also just call it the meaning that emerges to us in our first encounter. Rather than stopping there, we attune ourselves by significant commitment to returning to the same text, whether it's year after year or even day after day, in order to understand it differently. So I don't know if anyone else has had this experience. I have a couple of books in my library. I'm a big book annotator. Part of the way that I think is I think through writing, and I write in all the margins of my books. And the texts that I come back to, I write in different colors. And I have a couple of these where I now have 3, 4, sometimes 5 different glosses within the text. And for my friends for whom that's anathema, they want to encounter it anew again each time, and I totally understand that. For me, that kind of artifact of my previous thinking that I see in the margins is actually very helpful. And I can see that year I thought about it in this way. That year I thought about it in this way. And this year I'm thinking about it in that way. And why? Because the world's a different place. As we know, things change rapidly. I'm different. I have different questions. I have different concerns. I read the Torah one way before having kids, another way after having kids. I've read the Torah one way at particular points in my life, and the Torah differently at different points. in my life. And it's never static. The text doesn't change, and yet it's never static. Okay, so just to continue here, and then we'll move on to another source. Va'afilu b'chol adam prati, even within an individual person, nishtana ta'amo v'recho, v'v'chinat kabbalato et Torah mishana l'shana. One's ta'am v'reach, flavor and scent. Ta'am v'reach is a rabbinic phrase that means something like personal preference and understanding. The Hebrew phrase al tam v'reach ein li'itvakeach, in Latin, de gustibus non disputandum. You can't argue over preference unless you're Hume. You can't argue over flavor, over taste, because each and every person has a very specific thing that they like, or a very specific way of thinking about something, and that is something that is impressionistic. Right now, research has told us that colors are also like that. When I see red and someone else sees red, we actually are seeing somewhat different colors. And the same is true here in the arc of the human life, b'chol adam prati, in the same way that we experience things differently from one day to another, certainly in one generation to another. Certainly within the arc of our own lives, we see the Torah differently. Kol yemei chayim chayuto, v'chol zot tzarich hamaskil arotze lageshet el hakodesh lehargish bev'chinat atzmo. There are a couple of ways of translating that last phrase, which is that across the arc of the living and vital lives that we live, we must understand this. If we wish to approach the sacred, we must understand and we must feel this for ourselves. So lehargish bev'chinat atzmo can either mean we need to feel it for ourselves, as I've just said, or lehargish bev'chinat atzmo is that you need to develop this personal feeling. His Hebrew is very, very elliptical. Either way, I think it kind of gets to the same place, although they're somewhat different. You have to understand this for yourself. That's one way. Or, if you wish, lageshet el hakodesh, by which he means if you wish to step into the domain of sacred service. What must you do? You need to develop a personal sensitivity, a kind of what Michael Fishbane would call a sacred attunement to the personal quality of our encounter with the text. So is there any essential meaning of the text? Is it all projection? Literary scholars have been thinking about this for a very long time, as have rabbinics and rabbinic scholars, as have the medievals. We've thought a lot about this within Judaism, and the answer is yes and no. The answer is yes and no. The stability of the text is remarkable, but the capacity of the text to hold new meaning is one of the things that makes it so powerful. There's an engineering principle. Skyscrapers and other buildings that need to hold a lot of weight have to have a significant degree of fault tolerance. They have to be able to move and sway, and they have to be able to absorb enormous amounts of energy, whether it's in the form of wind or whether that's in the form of, here in the Bay Area, earthquakes. But one of the things that makes them stand even under those circumstances is that they can absorb all of that energy without cracking. And I think there's something about what we think of in terms of a canon, of about what Torah is for us, which does the same work, which is that because we come to these sources with a commitment, with a belief, and with an experience of being able to summon up a divine voice within them, we can return to them year after year, day after day, generation after generation, and with an extraordinary degree of stability also within that framework. to find an enormous degree of dynamism, of interpretive freedom and license, and an enormous degree of spontaneity and room for improvisation, all of those things that we have in the study of our texts, which is true of our legal sources and which is true of our agadic or theological or narrative or other kinds of sources as well. Okay, so far so good. Questions, comments, concerns, wonderings, musings? Brian.
Yes, thank you. This is so rich and wonderful. I just wanted to jump back to one part of this first text we've been looking at, and this wonderful phrase, the flavor and the scent. Is there a sense here too that the choice of using that formulation there also places us squarely in the world? It's about physical life. It's our bodily senses, and it seems to underline a sense that all of this discovery while we are in this life is not something that involves removing ourselves from embodiment and the world, but placing ourselves very openly and vulnerably in it.
I think that's absolutely the case. So Tam ve'reach are not only personal terms, but as Brian has pointed out, taste and scent, taste and smell are olfactory, right? It's about our workings as a human being, and the embodied dimension of the way that we read text, I think, is critical. So in part, that's about how the world shapes us. We're formed by the world. One of the reasons that Torah study is different every day is, well, the world's different for sure, and we are constructed by that world. It's also true we might be in a different place, literally, physically. And the fact that our readings of Torah are infused with that worldliness on the one hand, and that our readings of the world are also infused with Torah, it goes in both directions, is critical to this project. And we'll see this in the third, not in the third text, but in the third class when we talk about the world, when the rabbis of the Zohar get to a tree and they're like, oh, a tree, amazing. What they say is tzechota de oraita. Here there is clarity of Torah. And I don't think what they mean is like, now I get that sugya in Bava Batra, like I finally understand that little bit of rabbinic exegesis. What they're saying is tzechot means illumination. They're saying something about this encounter with this tree illuminates Torah for me. And so what do they then do? They say, now we need to give Torah to this tree. And so there is this reciprocity of, I see the world in different ways because I am committed to the text, and I see the text in different ways because I experience the world. And so this false dichotomy in between worldliness and commitment to spirituality just collapses before our eyes. And one of the things that I think distinguishes, let's say, Hasidic mysticism, but even pre-Hasidic mysticism, is that the road to the divine leads through the world in front of you, not by avoiding it or transcending it, but squarely through our performance and our action in the world. There was a book that was published a few years ago by a philosopher at Yale called This Life. And the point of This Life, Martin Heglin's book, is that we need to move beyond religion because religion is all otherworldly, and this life is what we need to focus on, and that's the only way we can have ethics, and therefore we need a kind of post-religious ethical system. And while every religious tradition has its share of texts that deny the world, you might also say exactly the same thing about philosophy, right? Like Heidegger. But in any event, there is a wealth of thinking within religion, and I think in Jewish mysticism this comes to the fore with remarkable clarity, that to understand Torah, you can't live in a, let's go back to that metaphor, you can't live in an ivory tower. If you want to understand Torah, you read the world around you. And if you want to understand the world around you, you bring to it that sacred quality cultivated through the art of Torah. And that's true of our ethical commitments, that's true of our connections to the world around us, and it's true of so many different ways. So Paul has put into the text, the chat, that a text needs to be supple and not rigid like an oak tree, which is exactly what the Talmud says, right? The Talmud says about human beings as well as about texts, Leolam yahe adam rach kakane velo ka'erez. You have to be soft. You have to be soft and supple, and willing to bend like a reed rather than like a rigid oak tree. And I think there's something very beautiful about thinking about either texts or perhaps better an approach to text which is rigid and steel strong and absolutely absolutely stable until it's not, that then collapses under the weight of its own incalcitrance. I think one of the things that's so powerful about this is that it invites us to plumb and to think and to recursively return back to the text. And so there's a version of this in rabbinic sources, right? Hafochba ve'afochba de kulaba, Ben Bagbag's famous statement, turn it over and turn it over, for everything is in it. The version of that source, which I actually like better, and I think I've actually shared it at Drisha in different contexts, which I think you find well represented in Hasidic sources. The different version of that, which is actually the Kaufman manuscript of the Mishnah, has a different version of it. And it says, turn it over and turn it over. De kula bach vekulach ba. Turn it over and turn it over, for all of it is within you, and all of you is within it. And you can put me on the rack. Those are not the same. It is not the same to say, turn it over and turn it over, for everything is in it, and to say, all of you is within it, and all of it is within you. The integration of life and text, of experience and interpretation, that you find in the second version of that, I think stands head and shoulders above the first version, which can be actively reading a passive text. And in its most beautiful formulations is a vision of the text as a kind of hummus or compost that you're constantly turning over in order to aerate it. Here, there's a kind of dynamic interpersonal, intrapersonal conversation that happens through the encounter with the text. If I want to know my story and who I am in the world and who I can be in the world and what the world even is, I turn to the text. Which is not the same as saying like, oh, I want to understand how to make a COVID vaccine. I'm going to look at the text, then it's going to tell me. I think that's a very a facile understanding of what I think that other version of the text is trying to say. It's trying to say, if you wish to understand the world, you look at tradition and you look at texts. If you wish to understand those texts, you look at tradition, but you also look at the world and you look at yourself. And in that conversation, what Martin Buber felicitously calls the intermediate zone of conversation, that's where God's voice is to be found. Okay, Brian, I appreciate that comment so much. I have a hard stop in 3 minutes today, just because I have a pre-existent meeting that I scheduled like a year in advance. So I'm also going to add at least 5 minutes onto each one of our other classes to make sure that we have a little bit of extra time, and I'll make the agreement with you that I make in all contexts. I'm always here to continue conversations either by phone or by Zoom or over email. I want to give you a few breadcrumbs to think about for the rest of these texts, and we're actually going to return to them as we move into the second unit and think about revelation in self. The passage from Menachem Mendel of Premishlan is about ta'am and taste, but I want to remind us that ta'am doesn't just mean taste, it means reason, it means wisdom. It means not just reason in the sense of rationality. What I'm trying to build is a semantic field of here. It's a kind of experiential wisdom or experiential knowledge that can't be described and can't quite be conveyed. There's a similar actual term in Arabic, which means almost exactly the same thing, which is the kind of knowledge cultivated from an intimate connection to an experience of the divine. So he talks about Kabbalah as a kind of hidden wisdom, not because it hasn't been printed, it has been printed, but because Kabbalah invites you into a way of thinking about divinity in which when you step into the text, you step into God's presence. There's a passage from Menachem Nachum of Chernobyl that we will indeed talk about studying Torah as a way of getting at the Ein Sof, the limitless inner vision of Torah. That's also going to be not only ta'am, but above the ta'am. And we're going to look at I can never figure out how to format things on Google Documents. We're going to look at a couple of other passages about the way that when we look at texts, we're invited not only to think about the world of ideas, but also to think about the world of practice. So this passage from Mishulam Weibisch Heller says that when we open up the pages of the Talmud, even if it's about an ox goring another ox, or what we think of as rather dry and arid sections of the Talmud that have to do with civil law, every part of that is an invitation to devotion. And he quotes his teacher, the Maggid of Slotchev, as saying, I don't care which book I'm learning, each one shows me how to serve God. And we'll talk about what that might mean and how we as readers might attune ourselves to knowing how to look at a source and seeing nothing other than let's say breadcrumbs and allusions to stepping into the font of divinity. So we'll pause here, and again, I apologize for the truncated time today. You have these sources. Continue to think about them. We'll see each other next week. We'll go deeper, we'll go higher, and we will continue our journey into the heart of Torah.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Mayse. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us today. Just a reminder, the next couple sessions of this class will be 75 minutes long instead of an hour long. So just for those who want to plan. And again, thank you so much, Rabbi Mayse. We will be together again next week. Lehitraot.